The point is, yes, by all means, pursue authenticity, but also pursue sincerity and also pursue profilicity. You can do it all together, but most importantly, be aware of the side effects.
Welcome, everybody, to our next podcast episode. I'm very happy to have with me today Professor Hans-Georg Moeller. Professor Moeller is now at the University of Macau, professor of philosophy, and he has published widely about, for example, Niklas Luhmann, multiple books, The Radical Luhmann, for example, The Moral Fool, A Case for Morality, and also about the Tao Te Ching, about Chinese philosophy. And before he went to Macau, he was a professor at various universities, for example, in Ireland or in Canada, and originally from Germany. So welcome, Professor Mueller. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you, Reinhard, for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you. And it's great to have you. It's a great honor to have you. One of the books that we want to talk about today is the book about you and your profile, which you have written together with Paul D'Ambrosio. And it's about identity after authenticity. So fantastic book. I have it here. Here it is, You and Your Profile. And but before we do this, and we talk about the question of identity and how identity relates to orientation, I was wondering if we can discuss what your impression is about your experience from studying back then in the 1980s. You were in Germany at the University of Bonn, and then you have gone to many different places throughout, and all the way to the University of Macau. And yeah, what your experience is in this long journey. Because one interesting connection between the two of us is that you were also a student of Professor Werner Stegmaier back then at the University of Bonn when he was a young professor.
Exactly.
And I was also a student when he was an older professor already, right before retirement. And
Yes.
so that's an interesting
Yeah.
connection. And yeah, I was wondering how what your experience is if you look back, because if you think of Bonn back then in the 1980s, there was probably a very different world in terms of the university climate, the intellectual climate, the academic climate. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, that's a very good question. Also related to, as you mentioned, our personal connection through Werner Stegmaier. Yeah, I was a student in the 1980s, and that was indeed a very different academic world from what is now my world and academic world in Macau, and how it was also in Ireland and Canada. Because the Chinese system or the Macau system, which is not exactly like the Chinese system, still they resemble more the Anglo-American system. And in the 1980s, when I was a student and Werner Stegmaier was my teacher, the system that was in place at that time in Germany was still basically the old Humboldt University idea of the 19th century, which was not really um, um, guided by, let's say, market principles. So I would call the system that is now more or less the global system. I like to call it the academic industry. And so the times when I was a student in the 1980s, that was still before the academic industry. Again, this was this humanistic education ideal. And important from a historical and specifically from a socioeconomic perspective is, I guess, that this old system, the Humboldtian system, as we may call it, want to call it, is was designed for a small minority of scholars, right? It was designed for, let's say, less than 5% of the population who would go to university, and you know, normally all male, of course, and somehow dedicated scholars who would pursue some form of, on the one hand, a broader intellectual Bildung, right? It is connected to very closely connected to the idea of Bildung, which is very prominent philosophical notion in Hegel's philosophy, but generally in the philosophy, at least of German Enlightenment. And Bildung, of course, means like spiritual cultivation, right? And and it also means that's from my philosophical perspective very important. It's this notion of Bildung is also closely tied to what Charles Taylor calls the age of authenticity. One way of explaining what Bildung is means it basically means not just the transformation of a human being that is still dependent into someone who is actually independent, spiritually independent, but also someone from transforming someone who is not really authentic to transforming into someone who is actually authentic. So the idea was also that the scholar, again, at that point in the 19th century, you have to imagine some kind of 19 or 20-year-old young man in some, German university town. The idea is still that they're not treated as nowadays as student. Actually, in German, we have this distinction between we call people who go to school Schüler, and those who go to university Student. Now, in English, it's all student. And but in German, the notion of student is usually applied to university students, and it doesn't really mean student. It means basically young scholar on his or her way to spiritual maturation and an authentic personality. So the idea, and so that means that as a student, when I went to university in the 1980s, ironically, I was not treated as a student in the English, in the sense of the English word. I, like everyone else, was rather treated as a young, maturing intellectual on the verge of being mature. And the expectation is therefore that you basically study by yourself, right? There was already a process of transformation going on, and both professors and students were kind of protesting against the Verschulung, against the schoolification of university. And what did this mean? This mean that at the university in Bonn, for instance, there were no attendance lists. The main form of, and there were very few exams. The main form of teaching wasn't teaching, it was professors presenting lectures. And you were free to attend the lectures or not, right? You just had to basically not even register for the lecture. Like literally, I just had to write down on a piece of paper that I then submitted to the university that I was attending or listening to this Vorlesung, to this lecture, but no one was checking it. And also, so the idea again is there are professors, and the professors share their ideas or their research, and it is up to you to go there and to do with this whatever you wanted to do, right? There was no tests again related to this. Even like going even a step further back, you didn't even apply to university. Once you had graduated from gymnasium, the highest type of high school, you were entitled to enroll yourself, right? Sich einschreiben, right? So again, this all shows this basic concept that university is for young scholars who are basically treated as independent, maturing individuals and it is their responsibility to transform themselves given the availability of these people who are already mature, who are already, went through the process to basically acquire that same maturity on their own initiative. And again, that is very important about the German traditional notion of Bildung, that it's not just like a passive process where you are being educated by an educator, but that Bildung is something you have to do yourself, right? So again, this is how this ties to the notion of authenticity. The idea is that you can only become authentic and independent, and we have the same idea in Marxism, through your own work, through your own intellectual activity. And so it makes no sense to basically check attendance or to even have lots of exams or anything. And this is then how you also would eventually graduate. You basically have to build some form of relationship to a professor. And that, of course, doesn't only means intellectual relationship. So you don't have to, the professor isn't even supervising you. You have to somehow convince the professor by talking to them or by presenting your written work to them or by mostly by participating in their seminars or in their Vorlesungen and in their lectures. Sometimes these lectures are small, and then the professor has somehow over the years will understand if a student is mature enough to graduate, and then the professor takes on the student and says, okay, you can write a master's thesis or you can write a PhD thesis under my supervision. But again, the supervision would be extremely light, which was like a big change for me when I changed from the old German system, and then I got my first actual professor job at a university in Canada, and that I was supposed to kind of proactively supervise the students, because that went somehow against the idea of the German system. Of course, you would talk to your professor, but again, the idea was that the professor would give you some feedback, but they wouldn't really guide you through every step or so. You would present what you had done, and then it was up to the professor to basically say, oh, yeah, that's good or that's not good. And that was basically it. So the student professor relationship was very different, and the whole system was very different. Of course, already at that time in the 1980s, it was kind of at odds, the system, with the actual reality. The main problem being that now it was not just like whatever 2 or 3% of the population that went to university, but nearly 40 or 50%. And so there were very few professors, there were lots of students. And of course, already at that time, in practice, the university was shifting in Germany at a much slower speed than in other places towards the academic industry mode. And so there was already this shift in the function of the university, that it was really becoming part, in the strict meaning of this sense, of the education system, right? That again, the university is not a place for independent younger scholars maturing through their own spiritual activity, but basically them being educated and turned into professionals. And that's this kind of, let's say, the actual real function of the university, or the education system, rather, as described by the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, which is completely different from the traditional self-description of the university in the Humboldt sense. And Luhmann defines the function of the education system, and thereby also of the university, which had now become integrated into the education system, as the function as providing selection criteria for careers, right? So the university is like now the top institution that provides degrees. And degrees are important, the core selection criteria for careers, right? A complex modern society needs to have some form, again, in Luhmann's terminology, system that fulfills this function, so that you can assign positions to people who apply for it, and the education system is constructing these selection criteria so that people can be hired or not for all kinds of jobs, ranging from academic jobs where you have to get certain degrees in order to be eligible to jobs in the actual industry or anywhere else where this becomes the decisive criteria for getting a job, making a career. So these are like, and this is, let's say, the core contradiction of the university and of academia, I guess, at least in the Western context, during the past, let's say, 200 years, between this traditional Humboldtian idea of Bildung and this actual function of the education system, namely producing selection criteria for careers. And nowadays, there's still the semantics is still there. You know, we still have inherited this Humboldtian semantics of Bildung and providing this kind of general framework for spiritual maturation in some form of, you know, general uh, sense. But of course, practically, it is now extremely evident that this is a academic industry, which is basically a big machine, a social machine for producing degrees. And yeah, and this kind of contradiction is, let's say, the basic framework within which my uh, academic and also personal life developed.
Yeah, that's super interesting. No, thank you for all these insights. And there's so many points that we could dive into, and well, especially we should talk more about the idea of profilicity, authenticity, and this shift from one to the other. I mean, maybe to stay there for a little bit more time. And by the way, I also experienced this shift. Basically, I got the very end of this old system still, having these old
Yes,
professors like Stegmaier, and I had a few others who were in this old
yes,
system. They didn't give you deadlines for any papers. The attendance was optional, and so it was on your own what you wanted to get out of this. I mean, I definitely appreciated the system because it gave you so much freedom. I always felt it was based on the idea that you are passionate about what you do, right? And this is what drives you.
exactly.
But
Yes. Hmm.
if you have people who need guidance, they struggle under that system, right? And I think that was one reason, at least in
Of
Germany,
course.
why they shifted, right, and made it more controlled, more bureaucratic, and more formalized in that sense. But it also
Yeah.
makes sense. I mean,
Schoolification.
yes, exactly, right. And it also makes sense. And I was watching your video about the academic industry, right, and the commodification of it, the how it becomes a corporation, basically. And this, of course, within the frame of what, as you mentioned, Niklas Luhmann talks about, and maybe for our audience is interesting, this shift, right, from a stratified society where you have different estates, right, or different classes where you stay in your class, we shift to functional differentiation, right? Where you have functionally differentiated social systems, right? And so in each of them has a different function, right? So in a
Right.
sense of a division of labor, in a sense
Right.
where you have the scientific system,
Yeah.
the political system, the economic system, and so on.
Correct.
I mean, and that makes sense, right? That you kind of you go into the system and there's a function, it becomes more and more specialized and specific. And this is, I guess, what we can see in the academic industry today as well, right? That you have more
Yes.
specialized fields, and you're working in this field, and then you build your profile in these fields. And I guess maybe one thing that would be interesting, since we're also a foundation focusing on the question of or orientation, of philosophical orientation, more precisely, right? And if we look at what this does to philosophy, and then, I mean, broadly speaking, also to intellectual horizons, let's say, right? Because it seems to me, even in these couple of decades, that, I mean, even the philosopher professor itself has become a different type to some extent, right? We become more
Yes.
specialized, it seems to me.
Obviously.
And then, but then also to the question, I mean, if we look at a big picture, right? If you look at, I mean, philosophy as something going back to, Socrates or even longer, I mean, as something that the human being does, right? And that's also something that we were just discussing in Puerto Rico with the foundation, the question of what are the limits of philosophy today, right? How is philosophy constrained? How is that what we can do in philosophy constrained, right? And then, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, to what extent is the main place where we do philosophy today is the philosophy department, right? And so, and then the question would be, how is philosophy as something that the human being does? How is that constrained today, right? How is it constrained in relation to function differentiation, to the shift of media, to mass media, to profilicity, and yeah, and to the academic industry, right? And I wonder what, I mean, your personal thoughts about this are, or and I know you also wrote this book, or you edited this book about philosophy and wisdom, where it seems to be like that question of wisdom seeking, right? Where do we seek wisdom, and how is that constrained today?
Yeah, these are many questions, Reinhard. I want to start again, like with my own terminology, which you applied accurately. Uh, the old system, the idea was basically, as I said, promoting or helping people to become more authentic. Authenticity, in my terminology, defined as the pursuit of originality, right? People become more original, they do original work, they have original ideas, and thereby they also create basically a higher level of authenticity throughout all of society. That was the idea, right? Through their own Bildung, they also like let's say increase the level of the Bildung of the whole population of society. So it's not just that individuals become more mature, also society becomes more mature by this, right? They say enlightenment, the same, like enlightenment is of course focused on the individual, but it is the same time only through individual enlightenment can society as a whole become more enlightened. So that's the old Enlightenment idea, authenticity based idea. But then, of course, what happened was actually basically from the beginning that instead of increasing, let's say, the level of authenticity of society, what happened in fact was a switch from authenticity to profilicity, namely that the university actually, it turned out, was not really making individuals or society more original. Adorno and Horkheimer wrote the famous book about the dialectics of enlightenment, which is basically describing precisely this, right? The Enlightenment promised to make us more individual and original. But instead, we ended up with a mass culture where everyone is somehow dumbed down. So the Enlightenment is not just not fulfilling its promise, it's somehow having the opposite effect. That was the basic idea of Adorno and Horkheimer's Enlightenment. And of course, this dialectics, the university is at the center of this dialectics, right? The university is not producing more enlightened, original, unique beings, but is producing more and more mediocrity, more and more of the same, more sameness in a sense. And but again, it's important to see what actually happened, right? So the university is about producing selection criteria for careers, it's producing degrees. So it is also proliferating profilicity. What does it mean? Profilicity, again, is instead of people becoming more authentic, what everyone has to do, they have to become more high profile. So instead of how do you turn yourself into from low profile to high profile by getting university degrees, right? That is very central to forming your profile. And the university is the institution which helps people to generate high profiles for themselves. And then I want to bring in, because after all, we're having a philosophical program, the key for me, or at least a key theoretical concept, the switch from first order observation to second order observation. Right, in traditional philosophy or in traditional academia, what do you do if you want to know about or whatever? If you can hire a person, whatever, you talk to them or read their books. That's first order observation. Nowadays, you have to look at the degrees. That's second order observation, right? You see how they are being seen, right? How they have been evaluated. And then you see what is the profile of their university? How is the university being seen as their observer, as the observer, that the person that the university gives a degree to, right? So also how we deal with philosophers nowadays in the academic industry is also, again, a switch from first order observation to second order observation. So the whole production of academic philosophy, of most of the texts that nowadays are regarded as philosophy, at least in a professional way, are produced also under the conditions of a second order observation system. and are produced within an academic industry, a functional system that is entirely prophilic. And as you say, that of course has a profound effect, right? Many of the effects are well known. One of the most important effects is that most of the books that we regard as philosophical, super important, and that includes relatively recent books like Luhmann's, all of his books. He couldn't really publish them under the peer-reviewed system, right? Because everyone would say, no, these texts are just like ridiculously long, they're badly written, they're far too complex, and then the reviewers would write all kinds of demands for Luhmann to revise his books, and that's basically, you can say this about most of the important philosophical texts in the history of philosophy and theory, until most of the texts until very recently. So that already shows you like the shift that has taken place. What we see in more concrete terms there is the rise of analytic philosophy, which is like a product of the academic industry. Didn't really exist as such before the academic industry. Arguably, something like continental philosophy already existed on the fringes of academic philosophy. I mean, look like people, whatever, like Nietzsche, or I would even call, and Werner Stegmaier would certainly agree, that Wittgenstein could also be called a continental philosopher. And doesn't need to be read in the analytic way, that the analytic way of reading Wittgenstein is not necessarily the best way of reading him. Anyway, so, or whatever, Kierkegaard, or name Sartre, whatever, name any of the stars, they were always on the fringes of academic industry. But basically, all of analytic philosophy, proper analytic philosophy, has been at the core of academic industry philosophy. Okay, they also write some books, but they mostly write these, short articles for special journals, and it's difficult to get your articles published there. And if you get your article published there, that's already a high profile effect, and so forth. So I would argue that this shift to academic toward like a dominance of Anglo-American analytic philosophy now also in China, the shift is taking place right now, also within the field of Chinese philosophy, by the way, right, which was somehow separate from the analytic tradition, but analytic tradition has kind of infiltrated it, or swallowed it, however you want to describe it, and is transforming it as well from the inside out, which is no surprise, right? The academic industry does that. So that is like a major shift that we see. And of course, another term, self-referentiality, right? All systems, all modern function systems, they are highly self-referential. And we see that, like, with the academic philosophy as well. You have to generate citations in academic journals by other academic writers within the academic system, right? My views on YouTube, I have a significant number. They don't count for like when I apply for promotion or whatever, right? What counts is the self-referential number of citations in academic journals. So this kind of self-referentiality has also, of course, been highly intensified within, like, in the academic system, because all modern function systems are operating on the basis of this self-referentiality. In order, you have to kind of be within the system, and then how to say, participate in the constant autopoietic self-generation of the communication that is going on within the systems. And in our case, this means just writing academic articles that are published in index journals, right? Yeah, so you see this, and of course that's the same. What has happened what has happened to philosophy. Let me quote Luhmann. It's not a literal quote, but I quote from memory, and general. I can't quote literally. In one of his works, Luhmann says there are basically three ways of doing philosophy nowadays. And he writes this also in order to explain why he doesn't like to be called a philosopher, or why he doesn't conceive of himself as a philosopher, but rather as a theorist. And he says basically in philosophy, people now do three things. Either they take care of the historical of the historical materials, right? That is still the traditional German way of doing philosophy, whatever. We study and Werner Stegmaier in part does that as well, right? Whatever, study the Nietzsche manuscripts, or right, and study the whole textual heritage that we have, and in this sense, do some form of conceptual reconstruction or intellectual history or something like this. That is the one type. You can still do philosophy under conditions of the academic industry. The second type is analytic philosophy. That is like very narrow academic debates within academia that no one outside of academia can relate to, and even most people inside of academia can't relate to if they're not in the field for a long time already, right? That's why, for instance, I have no desire to read analytic philosophical articles because I'm not in the discourse and they would make zero sense to me, and I'm not too old to and then generally not too much inclined towards these kind of questions, right? So they're very hermetic, and then you can become like you can write these very kind of narrow self-referential articles. That's a second way of doing philosophy. And the third way is very important, and didn't talk about that as well as yet. That is basically, and Luhmann uses kind of weird wording that I don't exactly remember, but I think what he means is these people doing these fashionable topics like ethics nowadays, right? And moral philosophy, political philosophy. So you have this kind of third class of philosophers. I know such a few names in German, and I won't mention them, who are basically producing, and I talked about this in some of my recent videos, basically political propaganda, who are providing out of the academic system some form of this now, like whatever, values is a big word in the political discourse. And so there is an academic class in philosophy that has almost a similar function. I'm saying this somewhat ironically here, as the theologians had in medieval times, where they were providing, let's say, the religious language within which the feudal class could legitimize and describe whatever they did. And nowadays we have, okay, I name one name, Habermas, and who came up with this kind of philosophy, right? Producing basically a very technical, moralistic, normative language, which can then be used by the political and general, also by the media in a watered down form to provide a semantics, to provide a moral semantics for the political and also for other systems, right? Whatever. Nowadays, even like big corporations, they have to, present themselves in terms of values. And again, that's not so different from traditional religious functions, right? Where religion would also produce, again, a vocabulary, which also the capitalists or the imperialists would use to justify whatever they did. So this kind of production of a specifically moral normative semantics, I think that is the third function of philosophy in the academic industry. And of course, none of these functions they all represent this dialectics of the Enlightenment. All three forms of doing philosophy. The first, the historical, to the least degree, but the other two they represent this dialectics quite strongly. And so I hope that somehow responds to your question of what, let's say, the academic industry has done to philosophy. And I guess let me finish with this. The implicit subtext of your question is, can we still do meaningful philosophy within the academic industry? I think we can, but it's, of course, we are fringe, maybe even cringe, if we do so. But yeah, there are still some people, because what else would they do, right? They don't find a job anywhere, and sometimes maybe they can smuggle themselves or into the world of the academic industry. But yeah, their leeways, their Spielraum, is increasingly narrowed down. So I would say they had much more Spielraum, much more leeway in the 1980s or 70s, and now they don't, because they have to compete in a very competitive framework for jobs that are much more difficult to get, objectively speaking, than they were like 50 years ago. So that that has a huge effect on producing philosophy. And again, to conclude with this, that's why I think that something like the Foundation for Philosophical Orientation is actually important. That we have, such, and we're going back in many ways to old feudalistic times, right? Where, like, some sponsors, Mäzene, as we used to say, right? They sponsor such leeway, such Spielräume outside of the academic industry. And I guess it's up to us, people like you and I, to use these Spielräume, to use these playrooms, literally translated, in order to produce hopefully some form of meaningful philosophy at the fringes, or even outside of the boundaries of the academic industry. And I hope and that in the future these Spielräume will attract more people.
No, exactly. I mean, these are great points. And I guess, yeah, it is the dialectics of enlightenment in a sense, right? But this notion of, I mean, philosophy, I mean, how I understand it is to ask these very fundamental questions, right? The most basic questions. And it's the opposite of being stuck in a system, right? It's the opposite of being a bureaucratic way of doing things, formalized and so on. I mean, of course, you have to have some kind of structure, right? And that's when you look at the beginnings of philosophy. Of course, there was some, even in the Platonic dialogues, right? There was some kind of way of how you do it. I mean, there's the logos, and you practice in some capacity and so on. But it does seem strange, right, in the way of how philosophy, I guess, as soon as it becomes a profession, there's something, I don't know, something that may become problematic in a way. And I mean, the one thing that seems to be systematically involved here, and that's what you mentioned about second order observation, right? There's this quote from Luhmann, which I found interesting, which you also quote in your book, is you don't need to know what the world is like. Once we know how it is being observed, and we're capable of orienting ourselves in the realm of second order observation, right? I mean, if you think about
Right.
in terms of philosophy, I mean, just very fundamentally, it means I'm just going to see what the other ones are saying, and I'm going to say the same thing. I'm going to respond to that, but I'm not going to look with my own eyes, in a sense, right? And so, just in terms of philosophical curiosity, um, I guess, I mean, to put it maybe provocatively, right? Are we a victim of second order observation when it comes to philosophy? Are we a victim of function differentiation, right? Because we can't truly philosophize anymore because we just look what everybody else is saying, or to put it in Nietzsche's terms, right? And I think Heidegger says something similar, that there's this notion of we just repeat what the herd is saying in a way, right?
Generally, I fully agree with you, Reinhard. But we shouldn't romanticize a traditional philosophy either. I mean, I would say philosophy has never been authentic and can never be authentic. Like any, and no one, authenticity, the pursuit of authenticity, is, from the start supposed to be. Is not supposed to be. It's from the start. It can't succeed because has too many paradoxes. So also in the past, whatever, if you were a philosopher, you were reading other philosophers. You can't, this idea that you can originally create a philosophy merely out of your own, like out of your own superb originality. That's not possible, right? Philosophy has always and will always been written on the basis of you reading other philosophers' books. And even if you don't read many, whatever, like Wittgenstein or Nietzsche claimed he didn't read many books, nevertheless, they are still operating within discourses that they might not have, absorbed by intense reading, but nevertheless by thinking a lot about the little they had read. So you can't be outside of this. And of course, also nowadays, still in second order observation, we still use our own eyes, to use a metaphor, or not so much a metaphor. It's actually, we still have to use our eyes, even if we look at a screen. And so we do use our eyes when we are engaging in second order observation, but we observe other observers. So in a sense, and we do so more consciously. So in a sense, that is, we are now intentionally, knowingly, reflectedly doing what maybe previously we haven't done intentionally, reflectively. At least in the age of authenticity, we thought we were authentic. Nowadays, we know that, at least if you reflect on it, that we orient ourselves within the sphere of second order observation. So we haven't really ever been authentic. But that being said, as I said, I was not just saying this in bad faith. I do agree with your point that something is wrong is wrong within Profilicity, and of course it is. It has to do with this kind of career-oriented, competitive focus, right? And that under conditions of Profilicity, it's very difficult to imagine again someone like Wittgenstein or someone like Nietzsche and so forth to be writing. But it's not because people nowadays are somehow less original, but because simply within the system of industrialized academic philosophy, you're basically forced to produce texts that are, and I'm not using the correct word here, more or less meaningless, right? Because they only they have this completely self-referential function, or the three functions that I mentioned earlier, as identified by Luhmann, which yeah, which yeah, not really producing what we would expect philosophy to do. They're doing something else.
Yes, exactly. That's an interesting point. I mean, maybe we can move on to, I mean, we kind of talked about this already, to the question of profilicity, the theory of profilicity. You say that the theory of profilicity is a theory of identity technologies. I always like that term
Yes.
of technology. I wonder if we can if you can say something more about what that means. And then, of course, you also make that claim that it's what is it? It's identity after authenticity, right? So that there was an age of authenticity that's now waning, that's now fading away, right? And so I wonder if you could maybe explain what that means.
Yes. So the core of our theory, Paul Dabrowski and mine, are these three identity technologies. And what is identity? For us, it means the sense of self, right? So we are not really born with a sense of self. We have to somehow build or construct a sense of self, and that is very, very important. For arguably, it's the most important, let's say, existential task that every person has. And so the idea is that we can use different technologies for building this sense of self. So first of all, this notion of technology is metaphorical. And it means basically both a psychological and a social framework within which a sense of self is built, which then again is tied, actually closely, not tied to, but can also be, I guess, expressed accurately with the vocabulary of the philosophy of orientation, namely that these technologies are different types of orientation. So a traditional technology of building a sense of self, both individually and socially, psychologically and behaviorally, is orientation to roles, right? And these roles can be gender roles. You're learn to build your sense of self in a female or in a male way, usually binary gender roles in some society, also traditional society, also third genders, but that's just a footnote here, doesn't matter. And then they can be professional roles, they can be religious roles, and so forth. But most importantly, basically in all societies, roles in the family, right? You build a sense of self in line, in orientation, I should say, to your role in the family, which is first child of your parents, but more specifically daughter or son, which are very different roles. And then, of course, it is a very different role if you're the oldest or if you're the youngest son or the oldest or youngest daughter. And then you build a sense of self in relation to your sisters as sibling. You build it, then you grow up, you build a relation to others in terms, for instance, of husband and wife, and then later on as father, mother, grandfather, whatsoever. So these are like roles by which that become central. Again, there are other roles too, right? But these roles typically they are kind of very stable, right? And others can easily identify you also by these roles. They don't have to ask many questions. It is very clear what a father is and what the role of a father is, not just to you, but these roles are kind of stable. They don't change, right, during your lifetime. The expectations towards the roles and whatever you can be a good Christian for a religious role and whatever or good Muslim, and then it's great if you go on a pilgrimage, right, or whatever. And in professional roles, right, whatever, like a farmer has to do these or that those things and has to dress in this or that way and so forth and so forth. And that's we call this sincerity. Paul and I we take this from Lionel Trilling. I won't go there. And that means sincere commitment to your role. Sincerely in the sense of both psychologically, it is expected that you sincerely identify, for instance, with your role as a mother, and that you also sincerely behaviorally, again, commit to, right? That you, whatever, take care of your children, right? So this sincere commitment is the mode in which you uh, live your orientation to the roles, right? And that's the first identity technology. There is also, in addition to the metaphorical element of the word technology, there's also a literal element to it. That usually the technologies that you use, for instance, the tools you use, are also role related. Women use different tools than men use. Farmers use different tools than whatever soldiers use. Whatever. Reading is like a tool, books like mostly to the religious profession and so forth. Other people don't need to read. There's no use for everyone having to being educated and being able to read or write. So you also have like the technologies, so the different technologies are also basically integrated or aligned with the identity technologies. Now then we have this shift in modernity, in Western modernity in particular, from the age of sincerity to the age of authenticity, where again, the mode of orientation changes. The orientation is now the pursuit of originality. So you're oriented towards. You always look for. We have this whole semantics attached to it, right? Originality, individuality, independence, and so forth. Uniqueness, right? Innovativeness, right? Creativeness. This is very important. Freedom, all of this, right? This is all the new vocabulary and these new values, these new footholds for orientation in an existential way. They replace the old ones, right? It is but now if you orient yourself too much towards the traditional roles, whatever the feminine is in the family, then you kind of have the wrong orientation. Then you can't, they are like obstruct your path towards, they're the wrong footholds. They obstruct your path towards originality and individuality. Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book precisely about that, right? That the roles, the traditional roles, especially for women, basically were giving the wrong orientation for becoming human, all right? You have to instead orient yourselves to these values of authenticity that I just pointed out. So, the core thing again is you always have to be somehow different, right? If you copy, it's not regarded as good. And how you were describing, going back to your earlier question, what a true philosopher should be, you also applied this. You were describing this also in terms of this vocabulary. You're also orienting yourselves in line with the identity technology of the age of authenticity. And we still have inherited this semantics, right? And now we're kind of stuck with this semantics that provides us with these footholds and these orientation points. But our society, and that's very similar to what we talked about before, is now already using a very different identity technology, a different form of building a sense of self, not of just who you are, but also who others are, right? So you always have to look actually at their profile. And people in reality, you and I, including you and I, are very much occupied in orienting ourselves, again, mentally and behaviorally, regarding the construction of our profile, right? This is like what we have in mind, and this is why we, again, going back to the Luhmann quotation, in order to do that, we have to be able of orienting ourselves in the realm of second observation. We have to always ask ourselves, how is this seen as being seen? And that concerns basically everything, but specifically our professional. And now actual technologies come again to the fore. Profilicity is of course strongly enhanced and again profilerated by the new technologies, by the new media, which allow everyone, we are now also building a profile, right, by posting this on YouTube. And even for the FPO, right, I understand we hired like a social media person. So we were not, when the person was present when we were in Puerto Rico. So knowingly or not, we were even having this meeting under the conditions of profilicity. And we had a profilicity expert and a profilicity designer there to produce our our identity as the FPO, right? And so we were already operating, even though on the one end we were supposed to have this subversive philosophy meeting, but actually we were also intentionally, it was our doing, right? Working on our profiles. And that's also the very context under which this very conversation is now taking place. So we cannot escape it, and we do not escape it. We don't even want to escape it. And because if we would escape it, it would be a Don Quixotic, not just fight against windmills, but we couldn't build our sense of self in contemporary society. We couldn't function in contemporary society. So again, the technologies we have, the digital technologies, they are geared towards, they support, they are the framework within which the ideology technology of profilicity works, and vice versa. I would say that the existential technology, the existential orientation towards profiles, is also giving orientation to the use of the actual technologies, right? We use all this digital technology to a large extent in order to enhance profilicity, right? All the algorithms that we use on social media and so forth, they produce profiles, they generate profiles, including our own profiles, right? When you turn on your cell phone, you see the screen that is produced by algorithms that somehow helps you or supports and provides orientation for building your sense of self in terms of profilicity. So the identity technology is not just a metaphor. It's largely a metaphor in the psychological and social, but it also refers to the actual technologies and how they are being used. There is always, let's say, a feedback mechanism between identity technologies and actual technologies. And again, as I said, just repeating myself, these technologies are basically orientation technologies.
Yes, no. No, this is great. I like that a lot, and that's also. I mean, it often reminds me of that notion of Plato when he talks about the pharmakon, right? Of writing, the invention of writing is something that is not just a cure, but it's also a poison. In a sense, it allows for new things, but it also poisons the process, right? So, in a sense, where once we buy into this new technology, we have to follow its rules, and in a way, it creates, yeah, a new value system in a way, right? And so, I mean, the whole thing, and so my background, as you know, is also strongly in Nietzsche, for example, in the philosophy of orientation, obviously. And this, this, these concepts of profilicity, authenticity, sincerity, they also seem to me very much like they're different moralities that are basically engaging with each other,
Yes,
right? So in Nietzsche's sense, a
yes,
morality is basically like an assessment of life, right? Of the values of life. Like, is this good? Is this bad? Right? And it's perspectival and it's competing, right? So that's his metaphor of wills to power. So that each morality is also a will to power in the sense of it selects, it wants something, it's perspectival, yeah, it selects something out, it has certain direction, ideal, values, and so on. And it seems, at least clearly, I think you can see what you're saying about sincerity to authenticity, that there was a shift in moralities happening, right? And the same, that's what you can see
yes.
in Plato, right? That's when he is talking about how terrible writing is and so on. You can see this shift, right? And I think that's something similar that's happened from sincerity to authenticity. And now I think that's your claim, right? That something similar is happening now from authenticity to profilicity, right? That we see this shift, and
Right.
there's many people who fight against this, right? And where you're saying that we shouldn't have this authenticity nostalgia, it seems just like Plato had this nostalgia for the immediate thought, right? It's in your mind and in the immediate spoken word. We're nostalgic now for something like authenticity.
Well, my point, how to deal with it, first from a descriptive perspective, again, I'm repeating myself, I don't know, for the third or fourth time, I guess it's important that we understand from a perspective of the philosophy of orientation that these are all different modes of orientation. And as you said, they enable different things. And they also come with different dangers. They are both pharmacon and they are poison, right? So they enable us, will to power, the same thing, right? But the will to power also creates different. Every will of power also comes with a different danger, something like this could
Exactly.
Nietzsche say, right?
Yes.
So they're all dangerous in different ways, right? Right, whatever. You invent the fire, and then, yeah, you also have the danger of, getting burned. And so uh, they provide different forms of orientation, and as you said, very importantly, also different moral orientations. Now, again, from both the perspective of the philosophy of orientation, and actually, and we didn't really talk about this. This is, I think, one of the, let's say, surprising affinities between the philosophy of orientation and Taoism. The point is, we can see none of them is as such right. Both the philosophy of orientation and Taoism are nihilist philosophies in that sense, that no type of orientation is as such right or wrong in an absolute way, right? No orientation is absolutely right or wrong. And again, every orientation creates certain possibilities and creates certain dangers. And um, the so that is why I am always pointing to the authenticity nostalgia, because from we are still inheriting the language, the vocabulary, the semantics, the ideology, if you want to say, put it like this, or the psychology for that matter, the existential orientation, my terminology, or philosophy of orientation terminology, towards authenticity. But so that means implicitly we assume authenticity orientation is right, and all orientations which are not, which are different, are somehow wrong. But of course, from the perspective of a nihilistic philosophy of orientation or Taoism, none of them is as such right or wrong. And the point is not either to try to hold on to the orientation that we regard right and thereby dismiss all the others as somehow deficient, nor to try to find out a new one that gives us finally the right orientation. That would be, not dangerous, or that would be morally simply good and not bad, right? Because always these things, like Luhmann, depend on the perspective of the observer. So, anyways, I think both with the philosophy of orientation and with Taoism, we can have not just this, as Luhmann would probably call it, descriptive perspective instead of a normative one, but a diagnostic, right? We can diagnose the pitfalls of the footholds, right? We can diagnose the problems that may arise if we choose this over that form of orientation. Another thing I need to clarify about my philosophy of identity technologies and the philosophy of orientation, that these different forms of identity technologies and different forms of orientations do not mutually exclude one another, right? And I think that's also very clearly in Stegmaier's books, right? They become just more complex, right? It's not that one technology or one orientation erases the other. Actually, it's a Hegelian. That's maybe the Hegelian root in both Werner Stegmaier's philosophy and mine, because that's the tradition we both come from. There is a dialectical, in this sense, our models are still very, very Hegelian, right? Aufhebung, sublation, which means not just erasure, but it also means kind of maintaining and even raising the other one to a higher level. Synergy, as we would now say in the modern speak, right? There are synergies between the different modes of orientation, between the different identity technologies. You can use them in combination, and we do use them in like whatever. Now the holidays, we still go back to our family. We still have, operate within sincerity frameworks. As you said, we are still, you're like the latest generation of students of Stegmaier. I'm the oldest generation, and we are both through Stegmaier tied to the age of authenticity and talk about have this. We don't both feel this nostalgia, and of course, we also all profilic. You have your channel, I have my channel, and so forth, right? So at the same time, we use all of these technologies, and we build synergies between them. Because actually, it's very good if you want to have a high profile to also seem very sincere or seem very authentic. In fact, you right, if you like, people put like on their profile photos, they put their family there, right? Academics, whatever, and they like, oh yeah, my free time, I like to go out with my child or cooking or something like this for the family. And then others might say, oh, I like to go on lonely hikes in the high mountains, authenticity, right? And so you can build your profile very much by synergetically using these other orientations, right? So we have a multiplicity, a high complexity of orientation in this. And again, was your initial, I guess, question. The point is not to find find the right form of orientation, or to say this technology is the right one and the others are wrong. Each technology, one technology is more advanced than the others. I would argue that Profilicity is the most advanced of these technologies, the most complex, but doesn't mean it's better, right? In some form of absolute sense. But because it's the most advanced, at least in our times, it's also the most dangerous, right? I guess in old times, in sincerity times, sincerity is very dangerous. People would have wars and kill one another or commit suicide. It's another topic because of sincerity issues. And nowadays we have problems because of profilicity issues. Anyways, so the diagnostic point that both the philosophy of orientation and Taoism can take on, which you could also call a therapeutic point, is to understand precisely this. No identity technology, no orientation is as such right or wrong, or as such better or worse than the others. That is the key kind of point, that the key insight that is necessary and that is enabled by a philosophy of orientation and by a Taoistic philosophy. This switch, this liberation from the idea that one orientation is correct one and that the task of philosophy should be, which many philosophers have claimed in the past, to give you the right orientation. And the philosophy of orientation, as well as the philosophy of Taoism, can do precisely this from a nihilistic perspective. Point out that the key is not merely a descriptive analysis of the different forms of orientation, but the diagnostic and therapeutic effect to move somewhat paradoxically the idea that orientation does not, the philosophy of orientation does no longer claim to provide or seek for or pursue the right form of orientation. And that orientation among the plurality of orientations, that is actually what the philosophy of orientation can provide.
Yeah, exactly. And it's no, I found when I read the last chapters about this Hegelian switch, it sounded very familiar. That's when it also clicked for me. It's like, oh, this is the common philosophical root here, because this notion, right, in Hegel, with, I mean, it's the absolute spirit, right, which is also this ability to switch perspectives eventually, right, and that you have a certain freedom of switching from there to there. And it's that freedom of switching, right, which is the livelihood of, or the liveliness of the spirit itself, which is and so because that's, I found your I mean, that seems to me also what was the message eventually of the book, and I have some quotes from it too, and it did remind me a lot of Nietzsche. Rather than defending any kind of identity as the right one, we recommend a suspicious attitude toward them all. Then I think you have this other quote where sometimes you may wake up authentically in the morning. You do your role sincerely, right? And then you can work on your profile at night. So this sounded a very
Right.
I mean, very like orientation for sure, that we basically today we live in a world
It was
with
actually a pun. That was a pun on one of the most famous quotes from Marx. You can whatever uh,
oh, okay.
be
Yes.
I don't remember, fisherman in the
Yeah.
morning and a critic in the evening and so forth. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry
interesting.
for
No,
interrupting,
no,
but as
no.
a footnote, I wanted to add
Yes.
that.
No, that makes sense. I didn't even pick that up, but that makes perfect sense. No, exactly. And that's, I mean, similar in the philosophy orientation, where yes, we live in so many different orientation worlds, and it's about the capacity to be able to switch between them, right? So that's what it's about.
Right.
I mean, Nietzsche connects this with the notion of the free spirit, what he calls it, right? And there's this nice quote in Human Ought to Human, the preface 6, where he talks about the free spirits. It's basically it's about becoming master even of your own morals in a way, right? That the morals used to be your master, the virtues used to be your master, ideals used to be your master, and it's about that you become master of your own morals and you apply them depending on wherever you need to go, right? So it's a very pragmatic orientation eventually, that you set goals, you set values, you set ideals depending on your task, right? Whatever your higher task is. And so that seems to be just like, I mean, and eventually, I mean, big picture kind of speaking here, it's his response to nihilism as something where we would hold on to these like fixed ideas of something, certain beliefs. I mean, what you call also fundamentalism in a sense, right? And the response to that would be if we can't hold on to them anymore, we make use of them, right? Depending on the purpose, depending on the situation, it becomes a very situational ethics in a way, right? And that seems to be also at the core in your theory eventually.
Yes, you put that very well.
Yeah.
It is again this kind of um, um, therapeutic effect in a Nietzschean sense. In Taoism, again, maybe bring in Taoism. Um, I use the word sanity there as opposed to insanity, right? That but it's very much like Nietzsche, and that's the big parallel between Nietzsche and Taoism. And maybe that's not so strongly emphasized in the actual philosophy of orientation by Stegmaier. That it somehow enhances, in Nietzschean terms, your life powers, right? And that you live in a way that is what Nietzsche would call life affirming, right? And in Taoism, the notion is sorry if I veer into Taoism, but that's my other background. The term I always use is instead of this somewhat maybe very Germanic notion of power, but it's also actually a very Chinese notion. But I like the Taoist. Use a different word in the Taoist context. My key word there is ease. Uh, Ease means like a state of where you're at ease, which is also, of course, a state where you are very powerful, right? Because if you're at unease, you're not really that effective most of the time, right? Whenever you're very nervous, you can't really write a good exam, but whatever. Also, in order to be what we call creative, right? It brings us back to the our first topic, philosophy, production of philosophy. You need to be somehow at ease, right? And maybe that's whatever my Wittgenstein, wrote in Norway. Not he was not really a person who was very much at ease. He was always, very strict and so forth. But still, he was looking for like an environment that would provide, let's say, environmental conditions of ease, where he would then could produce his philosophy. Or Nietzsche would go on a walk and then think there, and then write down stuff later. And so this kind of orientation towards ease, which is not an orientation towards a sense of self, right? But it's an orientation towards, some form of existential, let's say, state. That is very important. I would say that's a key issue in Taoism, and that happens uh, on the basis of the reflection on the fact that most of the time we're not at ease. And why are we most of the time not at ease? Again, that has to do with the identity technologies, with the pressures of the identity technologies, which are, of course, embedded in the pressures of society, whatever. Like traditional society was very difficult. People would, have to work a lot. They would be sick. They would have a lot of pain. Their life was a lot of suffering. There's actually, again, another footnote, a huge parallel between Taoism and Buddhism, that kind of reflections on not being at ease, on suffering, are very much informing these philosophies. And so they react to this kind of suffering, enormous suffering that humans, at least now we live in a world for the first time where we don't really suffer that much, whatever. We go to the dentist and we get like anesthesia, but these are all new inventions, right? So just your toothache, right? It was like unimaginable for us, I guess, what was normal for most people, that and toothache was one of the minor problems of suffering in traditional life. So life was full of suffering, probably more so in many ways than today. And so that makes it very difficult to achieve like kind of states of ease. But the main, like from a philosophical perspective, the main kind of frameworks that produce this mental and social suffering are these identity technologies, right? The pressures to whatever, be a good mother, be a good father, be a good son or daughter, and so forth. And So again, like this philosophy of orientation from a Taoist perspective, the point is not just to see, let's say, the contingency of the different types of orientation, but also to kind of to achieve some form of ease, or again, this was where you started with, some form of enhancing your productivity, your like, let's say, mental awareness or whatsoever, and to kind of to work towards that. And yeah, so that is another important, let's say, shift of orientation, where it's not so much about, again, now speaking more in terms of Taoist philosophy, even though, of course, we have to apply these identity technologies that in order to kind of, let's say, improve our level of ease, it's best not to be overly concerned with one's sense of self all the time. So that, we take a step back and we don't really care that much about our profile, about our authenticity. That's also for us, that's very important. That we don't care so much about, how authentic we are, how original we or like in traditional societies, that we don't care so much about our role identity. So that a major contributor to achieving a higher level of ease or a higher level of power is to be capable of not being too much obsessed with this kind of main basic existential orientation obsession that we have. The pursuit, since the commitment to roles, the pursuit of originality, or the creation of our profiles, right? These are the three basic orientations in the three identity technologies: commitment to roles, pursuit of authenticity, creation of profiles. And these three modes, they create lots of pressures. They guide our orientation. And then from a Taoist philosophy of orientation, we can kind of recommend, be a little bit at ease about these orientations, and take a break from them, right? And that will somewhat paradoxically enhance your well-being, and which is needed for being productive.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, with the philosophy of orientation, I would say what it does, I mean, it is descriptive, just like Luhmann in a sense, right? And so it describes different moralities, and it describes how people maybe get to ease and how people perhaps get not into ease and they get crampy or whatever, right? And so it's that notion. But there's this connection. We had the seminar together some years ago by now, where we try to make these connections between Taoism, where it's about the way, and then in the philosophy of orientation, which is about finding your way in a new situation, right? So there's this
Correct.
action. There's also the sense of if you found your way. In German, it's zurechtfinden, right? So there's this way metaphor is not as strong, which is also interesting, but zurechtfinden. But if you find, if wenn du dich zurechtfindest, if you find your way, then you feel at ease, right? So there's that connection which I do
Yes.
think is interesting. I think one should do some more research on this. I did want to pick up one other thread from earlier. We talked about this notion of the different moralities, right? And authenticity, sincerity, profilicity, and morality in a sense of if we understand it with Nietzsche, it's an assessment of life by a living being, right? So meaning one usually has the morality that justifies oneself, one would say with Nietzsche, right? So that every morality is self-righteous in a sense, right? So I live in a morality
Yes.
where I look good, or where I at least look, where I'm comfortable with myself, let's put it this way. And so I'm still like wondering about if we think about authenticity, sincerity, and profilicity as moralities that are also so for Nietzsche, moralities also have that function, right? The function of justification of yourself, of making things smooth, right?
Right.
Just like an identity has the same function. It helps you to live while
Right.
constraining things, right? That's also how Stegmaier
Right.
understands identities as always something that include and exclude, right? And they give you support, they give you
Right.
hold, while also excluding other things. That's the perspectival character of them.
Right.
So I guess in that sense, if the age of authenticity is over, or if it's fading and so on, in a sense, I'm wondering, and maybe that's my nostalgia, right? But I'm wondering, is there something that we lose, right? Or maybe maybe asked in a different way. So if you think of certain systems for example, the system of art, the system of science, of technology, of science, all of these, they value originality, they value creativity, they value individual contributions, right? And so that idea of innovation, for example, that what is new is good, right? That innovation is something that's valued, is something that came around only, I mean, Hans Blumenberg, right? He argues that it only came around with the Neuzeit, right? That the new was valued. So in modernity, in early modernity, is when we valued that which is new. And we actually had a seminar in the foundation as well about innovation. We connected it with leadership, but we also looked at the different systems, right? And how what innovation means and so on. And one of the insights was actually that it's all basically some aspect of second order observation, right? So in all in any wherever you talk about innovation, any system, it requires a system basically, right? Where you can be innovative. So an innovative, I mean, originally coming from the economic background, right? So you do something innovative in an economic field, but then it can also you can be innovative somewhere else. And so I guess so broadly speaking, right? And that maybe we can also talk a little bit about in terms of, culture wars, what is called this. But the question of, and I know you had this controversy with Jordan Peterson, right? And so it kind of ties into this. So in a sense, the question of if we live in a society that values creativity, innovation, and connected with this, the sovereign, responsible individual, compared to a
Right.
society which I mean, yeah, which I mean, it may still value them, but where the alternative to this could be something that is more of a like theoretical perspective, right, or a systems perspective, right, and so where these things are less valued. Right, so I guess so. I'm wondering, is the age of authenticity perhaps connected with a morality, right, that assesses life in a certain way, which are values that we maybe want, at least that's something in the West, right? We want a society that's creative, innovative, and that's based on the individual. And so even if it's based on lies, it could be based on lies, right? But maybe does it make us stronger in that sense, or is that the wrong question to ask, right? And I guess, and the larger question in the background is then what about different cultures today, right? But I know these were a lot of things right now.
Yeah, but this is a very important and very good question, central question, Reinhard. So they need to be addressed. Yes, I mean, Jordan Peterson, like for him, and this is like the little dispute between him and I, even though there was only very little interaction where he reacted very angrily to one of my videos about him. But anyways, the background of this is that, of course, Peterson is very much promoting this idea of the sovereign individual, and he also regards it, as you said, with all these other values around it, creativity, and the others you mentioned, all of authenticity values. So he's very much promoting them, and he was saying, I had a discussion on my channel with the um, scientist Robert Sapolsky, one of the leading scientists, and he wrote recently a book called Determined. And he and Peterson actually had a long discussion, also available on YouTube. And in the discussion with me, very briefly, Sapolsky referred to the discussion he had with Peterson. And according to Sapolsky, Peterson was exactly making this point, similar to what the point you are making, at least implicitly. Even if there is no such thing as sovereign individuality, which from a scientific perspective, like Sapolsky determined, right? We don't have any sovereignty as human individuals. We're not even individuals. We are determined. We are, contingent upon our biology, our history, our sociology, everything that has to do with it, our genetics, and all the whatever multiple things that are going on in our brain, in our bodies, in our societies, and so forth around us. So that the notion of sovereign individuality from a scientific perspective has no reality whatsoever. But nevertheless, Peterson said, and that is like, how to say, the standard response to this. Well, even if it's a lie that we are telling ourselves, that was your word, it's a great lie, and we should never give it up. We need it. That is somewhat similar in structure to whatever Kant who also basically understood that there is no God, but that we need it as a regulative principle, and that it's, useful hypothesis, even though we not just cannot never prove it, we actually basically know it's wrong. It's a lie. Noble lie, right? Plato. And of course, I see that. And that, as I said earlier, like all these constructs, all these orientations, they provide a lot of power. They provide you can do a lot of things with them. But at the same time, they also produce a lot of dangers. And both of them, to be more clear, I think it's impossible to kind of get rid of the dangers. It's just like I like to use this um, simple metaphor of it's like with medicine, right? Every medicine you have, it has its side effects, right? Some of them and there you can read about them on the information when you buy the medicine, but some of them only are known like years later when you have enough data and so forth, and then you can see. So, and in a complex world, in a world of complexity, and I believe in complexity as a basic framework of ontological framework. Of course, again, like the positive and the negative things, there's a multiplicity of effects, and if we call them positive or negative, basically depends on the perspective of the observer. So, what we call a positive effect is negative from a different angle of perspective, whatever. You take a certain drug, like an actual drug, right? And it has some very nice effects, and whatever, you drink a glass of beer, and you become more active, but, you can't drive a car that well anymore, etc. Right? But it always depends on the descriptive framework. So again, all of these identity technologies, they are very powerful. And all of them have numerous side effects that we can never even all fully, completely look at. So again, I'm just repeating myself again, sorry, Reinhard. The point is basically not to get rid of any of these identity technologies. I'm not saying I want to rid myself of my own pursuit of authenticity. That would be stupid. And I'm not saying my pursuit of authenticity or yours or that of our whole age, for that matter, has been, useless and we should never do it. That's not the point. The point is, yes, by all means, pursue authenticity, but also pursue sincerity and also pursue profilicity. You can do it all together, but most importantly, be aware of the side effects and don't idealize one. And yes, we can understand, and Peterson apparently even understood that the sovereign individual is actually a lie. But why only stick to this one lie? Why can't we have like more lies and alternative lies? Why do we only need the lie of the sovereign individual? And why do we have to say this is the greatest and best lie, and there will never be any other lie that can even get close to it? That's the problem of the sovereign individual. Once you become a fundamentalist of it, like Peterson does, and you can see the effects on him. Sorry, he's not he's not the most at ease person, and right.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. It's that makes perfect sense. And then I mean one could argue that even then sometimes it makes sense to be a fundamentalist, right? If one knows what
Yes,
to do,
yes,
basically, right? If
yes,
you're, I don't know,
yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
you're traveling to Mars and you need, 20 years for it, then you need to be a fundamentalist. You can't, you have to be extremely
Yes, yeah,
resolute if you have if you're running a
yes.
marathon or 10 marathons or whatever, right? And so, no, that makes
That's
sense.
a very good point, Reinhard. Yeah.
And that's also, I mean, and Stegmaier talks about this too in the philosophy orientation that we basically it's I mean it's not an oscillation, but we orient ourselves between extremes basically, right? The extreme on the one end of principle drivenness, of fanaticism, which could be fanaticism. I mean, each of them has a positive and a negative outcome depending on, or each of them can have a positive or negative outcome depending on how it goes, right? Sometimes it's necessary to be principled. Sometimes it's necessary to be flexible and
Yes,
opportunistic, basically, right? And that's, I mean, that's Aristotelian
yes,
ethics eventually, right? It's just a situational ethics of
yes,
Aristotle's virtue ethics. And that's also, and again, it reminds me of Nietzsche. He says somewhere that the erection of every ideal comes at a cost, right? And we should be aware of these
Yes.
costs. Right? And
Yes.
we become master of setting ideals, right? And I think what he has in mind is also to think about this in the grand scheme of things, that philosophers are like lawgivers, as he says, that for whole societies you set up ideals, right, and new religions, but knowing they're just, created religions, they're just created ideals, basically. Right? But it seems to be
Yes.
a very similar thought there.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. No, super interesting stuff. One question. So I also had in terms of if we look at it in because you work in comparative philosophy, you have a lot of comparative experience yourself, right? And so then of course there's this distinction between East and West to some regard, right? And I wonder what your thoughts about this are. I mean, one thing, for example, that came to my mind is that, as I said, that the each morality is a self-assessment in a sense, right? And it makes perhaps more sense in a certain environment to be authentic than it does in another environment, right? And just like in a certain time.
Yes.
For example, in the US, where I think that the emphasis on authenticity is even stronger than the jargon of
Yes.
authenticity is stronger than in Europe and probably much stronger in China. I haven't been there. And but it also, at least to some extent, makes sense that you still have the spirit in the US of the frontier, right? That you go to the frontier by yourself. You're there, you're facing animals, there's nobody there, there's no government, no state, there's no other, I mean, maybe some others, there might be
Yes.
Native Americans. And uh, and so
Yes.
you're on your own. You might need a gun for that, right? And so there's the spirit
Yes.
of that you are on your own and you have to be a responsible
Yeah.
sovereign individual. Whereas
Yes.
in
Yes.
Europe, you never had a frontier. I mean, there were only war frontiers, but there was never like exploring as a colonizer. And similar in China, right? And so it seems that that's also one way of explaining why this is so central for the American self-understanding. And but yeah, I guess I'm wondering. So somebody could, because I remember from the seminar that we had back then, that I think you guys mentioned that in China, that the age of authenticity was skipped over, basically, right? So you went from sincerity directly to profilicity, right? And so
Right.
I guess in a sense, somebody could maybe make the maybe play devil's advocate and say, well, the theory of profilicity is just a Chinese product from a Chinese culture, from a Chinese morality, right? So yeah, what are your thoughts about kind of these, the big picture cultural questions?
Very good. Yeah, of course, this rugged individualism that you described with the myth of the frontier, whatever the Wild West, Clint Eastwood would be. That's the second generation because the first generation um, Wild West movies, they were very much still focusing on sincerity. Right? There was a mix between, there's always a mix between sincerity and authenticity, but they are most like the first is often still like the family values are big. And when then we have this really rugged individual, Clint Eastwood kind of style Westerns. And of course, yeah, this kind of Clint Eastwood style Western, and then the whole, as you just described it, this myth of the rugged individualism that is very, very course. But it is born out of the European age of authenticity, I would say. And it has a lot to do with Protestantism as well, rather than with Catholicism. So there's a huge, huge framework that's there at the background. But generally, yes, I fully agree with your point. And of course, Jordan Peterson is himself a product of precisely that, right? He's like, so to speak, the Clint Eastwood of philosophy, right? And I don't know, do you know Clint Eastwood? Why not?
Yes, yes,
The
sure.
actor? Yeah,
Yeah.
because I spoke recently to someone younger person who didn't really know who Clint Eastwood was, so that shows how old I am. Anyways, um, uh, so then the second thing was, which is also I agree with you about China, the China context, and the skipping of authenticity, and that it is perfectly true that Paul and I, myself, we have this background in Chinese studies, and Paul lives in Shanghai, and he speaks perfect Chinese and has been working in China for many years. So that we developed this theory, this critique of authenticity from the Chinese perspective because of the basically absence of authenticity there. They also imported the framework of the vocabulary very clearly because, you know, with the spread of the English language and so the ideology, if you want, the semantics is there, but it hasn't really, how to say, trickled down culturally. So the semantics remains quite superficial. And in effect, how people behave and think is all, I would say, always in between sincerity and profilicity, and the mix of authenticity is relatively low, which enabled us, Paul and I, to see all the problems with authenticity and to see that we are much more like the Chinese than we'd like to admit. So, yes, it is precisely this kind of non-Western perspective that enabled us to see this kind of, let's say, the dialectics and the contingency, that's maybe the best word, the contingency of authenticity from the perspective of a culture and of like a social and psychological practice that doesn't really share the priority where authenticity doesn't enjoy this kind of priority. So yeah, it is like a Chinese, in that sense, a Chinese theory.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I mean, it is somewhat interesting. I mean, also for where I'm from, which is East Germany, especially Northeast Germany, where I think there was a strong emphasis on this authenticity, just also in a sense of because you live in a state that was observed, right, by the state. I mean, I was just born in it, but you still, picked up a lot of this mentality. And so there's this that authenticity is very important. Like who are you? Like meaning who like that you're honestly facing the others, right? What you show to the public is not important or it's a lie, basically, right? And so, which I
Yeah.
always noticed that difference, even there's a slight difference towards West Germany already. But then in the US, where you had a lot more of this shift towards, I think already profilicity in a way that you actually Jordan Peterson put this somewhere. I found quite fitting that he, as a Canadian, he said he's surprised by how theatrical Americans always are, right? And so this theatricality is something that I picked up when I was first in the US. I was like, why are they all playing a role, right? I mean,
Of course,
right? And
of course, of course, of course.
you
Yes,
could maybe connect this with sincerity as well. But it always found it
yes, of course. Yeah,
I found it hard to
for
understand.
felicity. Mm.
Yeah, I found it
I
hard
mean,
to
I had
understand.
the sorry for interrupting
Yeah.
you, but that is for me still like one of the first experience coming to America, and you go to a restaurant, and then the waiter comes so different from. Hi, my name is Sarah. What can I do for you today? How are you doing? Right, and of course, like for your German, East German especially, right, and you come to, you're kind of shocked, right, and you don't really know. You just that's such a you get you expect them to be authentic and then they overact so theatrically and simulated authenticity and yeah that's a mixture between sincerity and profilicity which are very close, right, because they are whatever sociology of Goffman, they're very much, theatrical performances. Right? The sociologist Goffman uses this term, I don't know, of the theater, which is then taken over by Peterson.
Yeah.
Uh, this theatricality is common to both sincerity and profilicity. Uh, it's a good metaphor. And of course, as you very rightly explained in Eastern Germany and so forth, and from a deep authenticity culture, we reject that. And for us, theatricality then is a negative word. right? But if you're like fully subscribing either to sincerity or profilicity, then you would have to find, I don't know, a different word uh, that is more positive.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's, I mean, and I know back then in the seminar when you brought it up, I did find it somewhat surprising that you said, oh, yeah, that this notion of this question of who am I really is something that you have never experienced with your Chinese colleagues or in general in your experience over there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I'm not uh, within them, but this kind of authenticity pursuit in my like personal experiences with Chinese people, they didn't really seem to suffer that much
Yeah,
from that question.
yeah,
Right? The question is much more, even today, in my context with Chinese people, the much more important question is, am I a good son? Am I a good daughter? That question definitely is much more important for them, in my personal experience.
yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, I mean, there's so much more we can th say, but we should probably get to an end. But maybe before we end, one question. So you have been quite successful in your prolific or prophilic identity on
Profiling.
YouTube on YouTube. Very prolific and prophilic, I guess. And the yeah, any wisdom from your experience, and I know you had this controversy with Jordan Peterson, for example, anything that if somebody out there is trying to build their own profile, anything that you want to share in terms of advice?
Ooh, that question I didn't prepare for that question, Reinhard, but I should have been prepared. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of luck involved in that. Like also that our channel became somewhat successful was due to algorithmic luck. It's like winning the lottery a little bit. And again, I would advise people not to be too frustrated if they remain low profile rather than high profile, becoming high profile. So that's a general advice, basically. But I can't really give much advice on becoming high profile on YouTube as on social media because again I think in my case it was very coincidental or like the in traditional times you were dependent on the mercy of God and now you're dependent on the mercy of the algorithm
Yeah.
and you all you can do is basically pray.
Yeah. No, that's great. And you, I think the last time I heard you say that you are finishing a book, or what are you working on right now? I know the last time
Yes.
we spoke, you said something that you're working on gender identity. And so, but yeah, what are
Yeah,
you?
the new book is coming out. The new
Okay.
book on gender identity is coming out in a few weeks, early February. It's called The Enigma of Gender with Columbia University Press. I'll make a video about this on my channel. I haven't worked on it yet, so though. And then I'm working on another topic, but I'll tell you about that other topic next time we speak.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you, Georg. It's been a great honor to have you on the podcast today. So thank you so much for taking the time. And well, Happy New Year. I guess we're there almost in 2026. And so all the best of luck to
Yes.
you. And yeah, thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much, Reinhard. Happy New Year to you too.
All right, thank you.